what our totems are is take a look at those animals that every time we start something new that show up within our life. You know, every time I teach a new subject for the first time, I always look to see what animal shows up, because it gives me an idea of not only how the workshop's going to go, if I'm going, or how that project's going to work, or if I go into a new city, what seems to be the animal that seems to show up more frequently. About 10, 12 years ago, I was teaching a workshop in Northern Ohio, which was about an hour and a half from my home where I was living at that time, on how to make animal masks and use them in healing ceremonies. And I left home the afternoon of the workshop to drive up to where the location was going to be. And I'm driving up and I don't see a single bird. I don't see my hawk. I don't see an insect. I don't see a single animal the entire trip. I thought, this is it. This is Armageddon, end of the world. I'm done for. And I get there and there's a group of about 30 people and we made beautiful masks. We did a great healing ceremony at the end. And I'm still waiting through the whole thing for the lightning to hit, because I know something's wrong because I didn't see a single animal on the trip. And it's all said and done and I'm pulling out and it's dark. And as I start to pull out from where we were holding the workshop, my headlights catch the eye shine of an animal. Now, all animals have a chemical in their eye. Those that are nocturnal have more of this chemical called tapetum lucidum, and it causes a refraction of light. What most people don't realize is that different animals have different color eye shine. So even if you don't see the animal, if you catch the color, you've got an idea what it was. I wasn't paying attention. My headlights have caught the eye shine. I'm still waiting for the lightning bolts to hit. I figured I'm not going to make it home alive. And I slow down, figuring there's probably just a cat or a dog that's out. And I get to the corner, and there's a raccoon sitting up on a sewer grate, watching me as I drive by. I don't get it. Doesn't make sense to me at all. I'm 3/4 of the way home when I have one of my frequent forehead slapping experiences. Raccoon. Mask. Duh. Raccoons have natural masks. They also have paws that are almost as agile as what the human hand is, with the ability to manipulate objects. We were making masks. It's also a nocturnal animal, so it's an animal that I wouldn't have seen naturally in the course of the day, not necessarily. And this is an animal that ever since that first time, whenever it shows up to kind of watch over and bring its energy and its medicine to that particular workshop, it's always after the course. You know, sometimes you really have to work to try and figure out what these messages mean. Sometimes they just go right over the head. Sometimes it's very clear. You know, sometimes that skunk just means take a bath. Other times you have to really work to figure out what it means. But take a look when you start something new. Take a walk out into nature. See what animal shows up for you in your life at that particular time. See what stands out. And sometimes it's not just the animal. Sometimes it'll be a tree or a flower. Walt Whitman once wrote a poem called A Child Went Forth. And the first thing that child saw, that thing he became. And he became that thing for a day, a series of days, or a succession of years. One of the best things you can do first thing in the morning, go outside and just sit for 5 or 10 minutes. At the end of that 5 or 10 minutes, what aspect of the natural world caught your attention? Is there a particular flower, particular bird, particular tree? What caught your attention? At the end of the day, look back over the day's events and then study something about that aspect of the natural world. And it doesn't take more than 2 weeks of doing this, and you start to see the connection. Because nature is talking to us all the time. We've just forgotten how to listen. We live in a time in which we've often separated the natural world from us. It's something to be studied, often something to be, unfortunately, taken advantage of. But we don't realize that we are part of nature, and everything that happens in the natural world has repercussions upon us. Everything that happens to us has repercussions upon the natural world. And no matter how much we cloak ourselves in civilization, we are always going to be part of nature. And it's talking to us all the time. So the more we attend to these things that capture that glance, that attention from us when we are out in nature, the more clear the messages become. Take that 5 or 10 minutes in the morning. See what stands out for you. Every time you start a new subject or teach a new subject, start a new project, begin something new in any way or fashion, take a walk in nature. See what jumps out at you. Nature's talking to us all the time. And sometimes it may be a flower or a tree, but they can be totems as well, even though we're focusing predominantly on animals. Flowers, trees, stones can be totems as well. We know they have their own unique qualities, their own unique characteristics and energies as well. You have aches and pains, go sit under a willow tree for 5 or 10 minutes. It'll alleviate them. We know just from an herbal aspect, within willow bark is a chemical called salicylate, which is the basis of modern aspirin. You have trouble handling emotions, feelings of guilt, go sit under an evergreen, a spruce, a pine of some kind. It will cleanse those feelings of guilt, those strong emotions, helping to balance them. I have a wonderful blue spruce in my front yard, and I'm often found sitting under it a half hour before my family visits and several hours afterwards, bless their hearts. But we can use these. Sometimes those communications aren't necessarily always going to be animals. Sometimes they will be plants or members of the plant kingdom, a tree or the stone kingdom. They may be something other than strictly animal. But take a look at those things that we need to pay attention to that are showing up within our life frequently. One of the most frequent questions I get are, what about astrological animals? And yes, they do reflect certain qualities, certain characteristics, and it's good to study them as well, especially if you're into Chinese astrology. If you take a look at that, all of those different months within the Chinese astrological year are associated with animals of one sort or another. There's an old story about how before Buddha left the earth plane, he put forth a message to all living life to come forth so that he could leave them one last important message. And I always found it interesting that no humans showed up, but it was all animals. And the first animal to show up was that animal that we call the rat. And so it was given the preeminent position within the Chinese astrological calendar. And this is an animal that we're going to talk about because that's one of those animals that sometimes people have a fear of, but it's an animal that is often greatly misunderstood. And we're going to talk about it in a little bit. But we need to take a look at those too and recognize that those animals that we call fantastic creatures, such as the dragon and the phoenix and the unicorn, the griffins, can also be totems for us as well, that they represent very dynamic archetypes. In the Chinese tradition, they tell this story about this great being by the name of Pangku. And Pangku existed in the world before it had any form, before it had any substance whatsoever. And Pangku decided at some point that he wanted to give some shape, some form to the world. But even for a being as great as he was, he knew that he could not do this task alone. So the first thing he did was create 4 helpers, the 4 sacred beasts, the dragon, the unicorn, the phoenix, and the turtle. And these 4 sacred beasts helped him to shape the world as we know it today. And when it was all done, the dragon descended into the waters to serve as a guardian and a protector of the natural world. The unicorn went to the woods and the forest to serve as an archetype within the natural world. The phoenix to the sky, the turtle to the deserts and marshland, to serve as guardians and protectors. And those creatures that we often relegate to the realm of fiction have a very reflective nature of archetypal energies found within nature itself. And they are there, and they do have qualities and characteristics that we need to study if we are drawn to these, that they are aspects of them that we can incorporate in our life just as easily as we can incorporate the qualities of a mouse or a rabbit or something other, some of what we call the natural animal life. They too can also be totems. And because of that, we need to pay attention to them. I often talk about one in particular, the unicorn, because it's one of the easier examples to demonstrate. This is an animal that people are still having sightings of around the world. And this is an animal that is very, very ancient in mythology, but even historically in many documents has been recorded as being seen around the world. To the Chinese, it was known as Qilin. To the Japanese, it was Kirin. To the Germans, it was Einhorn. To us, it's the unicorn. In the Middle East, it was known as Karkadan. But when we study everything that was written, for example, about this creature that we call the unicorn, There is a phenomena of common threads that ran through it. It was considered the gentlest of all the animals upon the planet. The Chinese said that it could walk upon the grass without breaking it, that it had the capability of healing the greatest wounds upon the earth. And this is an animal that is often found in certain kinds of environments, that will often appear among herds of deer, will show up where there are certain other kinds of animals, that it aligns themselves, that these great archetypes that we've mythologized to a great degree and made to be something associated with the realm of fiction still exist within the natural world. And yes, they can be totems for us. They do have qualities and characteristics that we can incorporate into our life just as well as what we can on any other level with other animals. There's a story that came out of Eastern Europe shortly after the Middle Ages. And it was at that time when typhoid was running rampant through Europe, and people were dying by the hundreds and thousands, and there was a very, very long drought. So people were able to finally figure out that water sources were contaminated. And because of the drought, wells and such couldn't be used. People were starving and dying. And in one little town, the people were on their last bit of hope. And they had gathered together trying to figure out what can we do, because there were very few healthy people left in this town. Those that hadn't died were very ill. And as often happens in times of great crises like this, people begin to look for unusual kind of remedies. And someone at this gathering suggested maybe what we need to do is find ourselves a unicorn. Because people didn't know that much about the unicorn, but they were sure that it could pretty much heal anything that came along. The only problem was no one understood too much about it. And one of the women stepped forward by the name of Katya. And Katya said, "I will go in search of this unicorn for you." And everyone looked at her and they said, no, you can't do this. We don't know much about the unicorn, but we know that you have to be a virgin in order to attract a unicorn. You've got a family and 4 or 5 kids. You can't be going out. We'll never succeed. And Katya looked at him and said, "It's not purity of the body, it's the purity of the heart." And ignoring what the people said, she left her family and she went in search of a unicorn. And she walked in the direction of the sun and walked until she could walk no further. And she was thirsty and she was afraid to drink along the way, knowing that the waters may be contaminated. And she collapsed beside a small stream. And at the far opposite end of the stream, there was a large wooded area. And she wanted to drink so badly, but she was afraid that the stream was polluted and that she would get sick. And she sat there crying, hopeless. And there was a soft tinkling of bells as a breeze brushed over her. And she lifted her face, and stepping out of the woods was this wondrous creature that we call the unicorn. And it fixed her with her eyes, and then it stepped forward and it lowered its head, dipping the alicorn, the horn, into the stream. And the stream began to swirl and bubble like it was being brought to a boil, and then stilled. And at that point, all the animals came out of the woods and drank. And Katya knew that the water had been purified and cleansed. And so she leaned over and she drank her fill. It was the sweetest, coolest water that she felt she had ever tasted in her life. And when she lifted her face from the water, all the animals had gone, but the unicorn stood there. And they looked in each other's eyes, and the unicorn knew her heart and stepped across the stream and began to follow Katya back to her village. And all along the journey back, they would stop at the homes of people that were sick, and the unicorn would come into the home and lower the head and the alicorn over the ill person, and the person would gently wake up, healed. They would dip the head into the wells, and the water would bubble and be stirred up and then still cleansed and purified. And when she finally made it back to her village, and they had cleansed all the water sources, and all the people had been healed, Katya was standing with her family in hand, the unicorn beside them, and all the people are gathered together. And then someone in the back whispers, "What if we get sick again?" And someone else answered, "Well, you know, it's the horn that has the magic." And even though it was whispered, it roared like thunder in the ears of the unicorn. And before anyone could even blink, it had turned and disappeared down the road and into the woods. And tears ran down Katya's face. And she looked at the people, amazed that they could even think such a thing after the gift that they had been given. And without another word, she turned with her family in hand and left the village, never to return. And from that day forth, whenever problems, tragedy, illness struck this village, there was no one there ever to help again. The unicorn is one of those archetypes of the natural world, a common totem throughout Europe that is one of the greatest and gentlest of the healing archetypes found in the natural world. It will often make its presence known among herds of horses, deer standing out in the field if you look closely, and usually in environments that have cedar trees and apple trees. And it's interesting because we see remnants of this still today, because if you drive down a highway and stop at one of the gift shops, you'll find cedar boxes painted with the heads and faces and figures of unicorns. And the trouble is, most people don't understand why this is so. And it was always believed that the unicorn kept its greatest healing treasures in a cedar box underneath an apple tree. And so those environments that have apple trees and cedar trees and a good deal of wildlife like pheasant and deer are environments in which you're more likely to find and encounter some of these so-called fantastic creatures. But they can also be totems just as much and just as significant and just as important and empowering to our life as those animals that we consider more natural. And so we need to take a look at them as well too. You know, there's always a tendency to think that these animals aren't real, it's just mythology, and anything associated with nature spirits of any kind are often considered, things that people roll their eyes at. And yet, the truth is, most kids are aware of these spirits that are out there in nature. Most kids are aware that their animals are communicating. And unfortunately, we get socialized out of that. Parents will say, oh, aren't they so imaginative? Isn't that so cute? And it sends the message that what they're experiencing isn't real. As I had mentioned, for many years, I worked at a nature center in Ohio. And I loved doing the trail guide, particularly with the preschoolers. Because, well, first of all, with preschoolers, you don't have to walk far. But second of all, you don't have to get real botanical. And the last summer that I was working there, I was taking a group of preschoolers out. And usually what I did with the preschoolers is I would take them along one particular trail at the nature center, and I would talk about the fairy lore, the spirit lore, some of the animal lore associated with the plants and the trees, and tell them stories along the way. And we're halfway through this little hike with these kids and their parents and their teacher, and this little boy steps up from the back and he puts his hands on his hips and he gives me a look and says, well, how do they get in and out of these trees and flowers and stuff then? And talking in regards to the nature spirits. And I said, well, now some people say they come in through the little openings down at the base of the trees by the trunk. And this little girl steps forward very quietly and she says in a very soft voice, says, they use this flower, and this little hole right over here. Well, the girl's mother went white. She was just aghast, and the teacher kind of rolled her eyes, and I'm jumping up and down inside thinking, yes, thinking this is great. And then through the rest of the hike, that little girl and that little boy were plastered to my leg. An adult that confirmed what they'd been experiencing all along. And kids experience this in nature. I took this same group at a boardwalk that crossed the pond, and I told this same group that, they used to say that if you got down and tickled the water just right, all the water fairies would come out riding on the backs of dragonflies. And I made the whole class get down. I made the parents, the teachers, and we just tickled the heck out of the water. And when we stood up, there must have been 200 dragonflies circling us. It was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had at the center. The center's director came up to me a couple days later and she says, I heard about your group the other day. I don't really want to know the details. I just kind of shrugged and went on. But kids are aware of this. And there's a part of us that is also aware of this, a part of us that has always known that these encounters with animals, that these things that capture our attention out of the natural world have great significance, have a great meaning for us, and we need to start paying attention to them. The first step is paying attention, acknowledging them. The second step is then studying something about it to figure out what it means and how to apply it to your life. You know, if you have that unusual encounter, such as I spoke of earlier, such as an owl in the daytime showing up in your life, or something that's an unusual and extraordinary encounter, take a look at what's been most on your mind in the previous 3 hours. Because especially with extraordinary encounters, those things that are most important are the ones that are going to grab our attention. And if it's something that's weighing on our mind, that's usually where the extraordinary encounters come in. And there's something that animal can teach us on how to resolve or give us some insight into regards to what that particular issue is. One of the questions I often get in regards to identifying what our totems are is people say, well, you know, I keep seeing dead animals all the time. Are these my totems, or does this mean my totem is dying? And my answer is no, it does not. It never does mean that your totem or that animal's qualities are dying within you. Unfortunately, and especially in the case of roadkill animals, we often find that people say, you know, I see all these roadkill animals, what's this doing? In all my years of traveling and teaching on this and across the United States, I've seen almost every species of wildlife as roadkill at one time or another. And it's very, very sad. But at the same time, I always at least offer some prayer for that animal's spirit to move on so that the next person that notices it isn't hit quite as emotionally by the impact. We live in a time where the human world and the natural world intersect, that there are sometimes casualties. But I'm always amazed at how many people don't pay attention to these animals that are out there. I look at them, I recognize them, and I try to do a quick assessment. Does this animal apply to something that's going on in my life right now? Or do I just need to say the prayer and let it go and let its spirit move on? And sometimes that's really all we need to do. So the next person that notices it isn't hit quite as intensely, doesn't feel that punch in the stomach in regards to that animal, allows that spirit to move on. And if you honor one aspect of the natural world, you honor all aspects. And this is one way of doing that honoring process with it. But those animals that do die do have qualities, do have characteristics that are significant too. People say, you know, I have these animals and they just come into my backyard and they die. You know, what is this saying? Why am I living? For an animal to let down its defenses, to come into an environment to where it shows vulnerability is unusual, because animals are great at camouflaging any kind of vulnerability, any kind of weakness, because it ultimately and immediately opens them up to predation in the wild. So if an animal is coming into your environment and they're letting its defenses down so that it can die, this is a tremendous honoring of you and your environment, because it says this is a safe place. This is where I can let the transition occur without worry about the trauma of being preyed upon. And so it is an honoring of you, and it is not something to be fretting about. It is significant, and you want to treat it as such. And if it seems to be the same kind of animal, maybe it's because there's some connection there. And again, do some kind of assessment. Take a look at that. You know, there are a lot of ways in which we can figure out what our totems are. There are some that are a little bit more unusual. People will say, well, you know, I went to a psychic and the psychic told me what my totem was. And that can be a very legitimate way of doing it, especially if you study the animal and it seems to fit what's been going on in your life. If it applies, it could be very legitimate. It's always easier and more important if we figure it out for ourselves, but there are other ways we get will take on forms and shapes. And this is an amazing time to be living, because we're living in a time in which we're seeing a blending of science and mysticism in ways in which we have never seen before. And one of those ways is particularly in regards to the human body and the human energy system. Human body is an absolutely magnificent mechanism. We give off light, we give off sound, we give off electricity, we give off magnetics, we give off thermal energies. We are a walking, talking, breathing energy system, and we have this whole field of energy that surrounds us that is measurable. We have the technology today that is able to measure all these frequencies that the human body gives off. And this thing that we call the human aura was so often scoffed at by the scientific community. But we now have the technology that is able to verify that, yes, there's something here. At these 7 traditional points of the chakras on the body, there's a higher degree of electromagnetic emanation that comes from the body at those particular points, all very measurable. So we're living in a time where the scientific community, which used to scoff a lot at metaphysics and mysticism, is now having to reevaluate. And in one area, it's the area of the human aura. People often say, I really want to learn to see the aura. Seeing the aura is a physical condition. Anyone can learn to see the aura. There are ways of stimulating the cones and rods, which are the energy fibers in the eye, that help us to take in greater degrees of light and color, and to differentiate the lights and colors a little bit more effectively. Understanding what you see is a little bit more difficult, because you can have multiple colors, multiple shapes, things going on in the human aura. Every time we have a change of thought, change of emotion, there's a change in the auric pattern. Sometimes the aura will take on the form of a particular animal, and that gives you a way of understanding. So learning to see your own aura, learning to see the auras of others, is one way of being able to figure out what one of your primary totems might be. Another is by studying animals and the way they move. If you take a look at some people, take a look at how they posture, how they walk, how they stand, and see if you can apply that to different animal species. We often have people say, oh gosh, she looks like a little old bird. She walks around like a bear, lumbers around like a bear. The way a person moves, the way they posture, the way they walk, will give clues also to the kind of animal that may be one of their predominant totems. So studying some of those more unusual ways is a way of helping you to further pinpoint exactly what your spirit animal truly is, and helping you to understand. One of the things that we need to keep in mind once we start to do this, and we have this animal show up in our life, our first responsibility is to study it, to learn as much about it as possible, because the more we understand this animal, the more we understand its qualities and its characteristics, the more easily we will be able to apply that to our own unique life circumstances. And there are 4 things that I often teach people to study in regards to that animal when it does show up within your life. And the first of these is to learn something about that animal's biological rhythm. Every animal has its own unique biological rhythm. Times where it's more active, times where it's least active, times where it's more sexual and procreative, times where it is not. Every animal has its own unique biological rhythm. And that animal has shown up in your life to say, look, part of the reason I'm here is that this is the rhythm that's at play within your life. If we recognize that and incorporate it, we save ourselves a lot of frustration. We're not banging our head against the wall wondering, why aren't things working along the time frame that I want it to work? Because there's a more universal rhythm at play. And if we put ourselves into that animal's rhythm, things will unfold much more smoothly, with less frustration, and in a much more empowering manner than if we tried to force it. So let's say, for example, you're having encounters with bears, whether it's physical encounters, you're seeing them all the time, every time you turn on the TV, or you're dreaming about them. Bears are amazing creatures with a unique biological rhythm. As late winter and fall approaches, they usually slow down their outer activities. That's when they usually build their den. In the winter months, they go into their den. That's when the female bear usually gives birth to the young. It's 2, sometimes 3 cubs. In the spring, the cubs are brought out into the open, and then the cubs will usually stay with the mother bear for up to 2 years before they go off on their own. If you have bears showing up in your life, as late fall, winter approaches, slow down your outer activities. Pull back into your den a little bit. Focus on 2, maybe 3 projects. In the spring, bring them out into the open. But recognize it may take as much as 2 years before they mature and really go off on their own for you. If we recognize that, we save ourselves a whole lot of frustration. We recognize that there's a greater rhythm at play, and we let things take their natural course. We're putting our own life rhythm into the rhythm of that particular animal. And every animal has its own unique biological rhythm. And part of the reason it's shown up in your life is to say, look, this is the rhythm that's at play within your life. Don't fight it, just go with it. Things will work out much more effectively for you. The second thing to look at and to study about that animal when it shows up is to study what its natural qualities and characteristics are. Every animal has unique qualities, unique characteristics, unique ways in which it does things. And that animal has shown up in your life to say, look, these are what will work for you right now. Don't try and do something else right now. These are the things that will work for you. So for example, if a hawk misses capturing a rabbit, it doesn't try and pretend it's a weasel and chase it on foot. It has to learn to be true to the hawk characteristics. Fly faster, strike harder, do all of those kinds of things. This is part of what its natural qualities and characteristics is. And study that animal's natural behaviors and how it works and utilize them, and then incorporate them into your own life. If this is a turtle, an animal that moves very slow but very steady, don't be rushing so much. Slow things down. That animal has shown up to say, look, these qualities, these characteristics that I have are the ones that are going to work for you right now. Utilize them, take advantage of them. This is what's going to work for you. The third thing to study in regards to that animal is how it adapts to survive in the wild. Every animal has adaptations, things that they do in order to survive, and that animal has shown up in your life to show you the best way of adapting to accomplish tasks more effectively within your life. This is something that occurs with every animal. Sometimes it's a physical adaptation, but animals all have behavioral adaptations. Physical adaptation are like foxes, especially desert foxes, but all foxes have extra large ears for members of the canine family. And this is because they dissipate a lot of their body heat through their ears. You have foxes showing up in your life and you're having difficulty handling the heat, brush the hair behind the ears. It will make you feel comfortable, much more comfortable. Take a look at how that animal adapts behaviorally to survive in the wild. Mule deer never follow the same path to a water source. They always alter it because instinctively they know that if they don't, they open themselves up to predation. If you have mule deer showing up in your life, don't do the same thing in the same way twice. It won't work for you. Alter it, change it, shift it around. Crows are amazingly adaptable animals. If a bird of prey, for example, comes in to their territory, a hawk or especially the great horned owl, which is their mortal enemy, they will do what's called mobbing. They will gang up on it as a way of driving it out of that territory. It's a way of being able to survive, because if they don't do that, that owl's going to come back later at a time and have one or two of them for dinner. You have crows showing up in your life. Don't be trying to tackle your problems by yourself. Get some help. Get some assistance. That's an adaptive behavior. Rats and mice are very adaptable animals. They are extremely unique in that one of the ways in which they survive as a species is to be very prolific. They have lots and lots and lots of babies. They're the most common prey animals. And so they get preyed on a lot. So as a species, they have lots of babies. Now, not all of them survive, but enough do that the species itself is able to grow and expand and stay alive and survive under predatory kinds of conditions. So if you have rats and mice showing up in your life, don't be trying to limit yourself to one or two things. Get involved in this and this and this and this and this, and as many things as possible. They all won't work, but enough of them will succeed that you will be able to also be a little bit more successful within your life. Take a look at those kinds of things of how that animal adapts to survive. I mentioned earlier that I go into classrooms with my hawks and owls and I do educational programs. And I also have rats that I have as pets. I have rats and mice that I also feed to the animals, but I also have those that are pets. And so I always take the pet rats in so that the kids will have something that they can touch, because they're not allowed, it's a federal law that they cannot touch the owls and the hawks, any bird of prey. And so I always take one of the rats in, not to feed them in front of the kids, but so that they can have something to touch. And one of my favorite rats who died recently was a rat by the name of Alibaba, and he was just absolutely amazing. Would let the kids just pet and stroke him, and they could feel how weird his tail was, and he didn't get upset by it. They could feel how soft his fur is. And it provided an opportunity to teach them something about rats. Rats are actually very, very clean animals. They are actually also great architects. They are constantly changing their home design. But they always have a place where they store their food, they have a place where they always sleep, and they have a place where they always go to the bathroom. So they have these places, but then they redesign everything else. They're very particular about that kind of thing. But we need to understand that these animals have adaptive behaviors. And these adaptive behaviors are what enable them to survive. And part of what they've done to show up in your life is to say, look, these adaptations will work for you as well. The fourth thing to study about that animal that will make your life flow a little bit more smoothly is to study this animal's relationship to other animals and the environment in which it is normally found. Most animals have an environment to which they're indigenous, where they are more normally found than other. And that animal shares that environment with other species of animals. Sometimes it's an antagonistic kind of thing, sometimes it's compatible. But take a look at how it relates to other animals in that environment, and it will provide some insight into your own personal relationships. For example, coyotes and badgers often share the same territory. They're not very friendly to each other, but if the winter is harsh enough, they will do what's called cooperative hunting. Coyote has a tremendous sense of smell, and it can find prey, voles, and mice under several feet of snow. The badger's a tremendous digger. So the coyote will find the prey, the badger will dig it out, and they'll share the prey. And it's a cooperative hunting that if the conditions are right. Take a look at how this animal relates to other animals within that same environment. And take a look also at the kind of environment in which it is found. Ducks and geese are water birds. They are often found in marshlands and wetlands, areas where there is a natural decomposition going on. And that environment gives us some clues as to the role and where this animal will play within our life. Marshlands are areas of decomposition. There's a breaking down of old growth so that new growth can occur. So if this is an animal that is found naturally, that's indigenous to that kind of environment, this is an animal in some way is going to help you break down and institute some new growth in some area of your life. So take a look at the kind of environment. Is it a desert environment? People think desert environments are just nothing but lifeless things, but there is life there of great wide variety. But it's a little bit different, a little bit more subtle, and these are plants and animals that have learned to live under very, very harsh, sometimes extreme kinds of conditions. And so those animals that are more indigenous to that kind of environment can show us how to handle some of the more extreme conditions of our own life. Study something about that environment a little bit more effectively. Learn something about its qualities and its characteristics as well. That animal and its environment will tell you something about your own relationships and how to work with those relationships a little bit more effectively. So when we study that animal, we always want to begin with starting with those four things, starting with the biological rhythm, looking at its basic qualities and characteristics, study how that animal adapts to survive in the wild, and take a look at its relationship to its environment, because it'll tell you something about your own relationships. And at the very least, learn that much about the animal. Let's take, for example, you have rabbits showing up in your life, which I love when rabbits show up in our life, because they are always an indication that you don't have to invest a great deal of time and energy before you see how things are going to unfold or play out for us. One of the things that we need to understand is that rabbits have had kind of a mixed symbology all over the world. To the Plains Indians, they were considered a symbol of fear because they freeze. To the Algonquin, they were considered kind of a demigod. To the ancient Egyptians, the hare was one of the hieroglyphs for the soul. To the ancient Hebrews, it was considered an unclean animal because they were so prolific. They do what bunnies do. They make other bunnies. To the Japanese and the Chinese, there wasn't a man in the moon, there was a hare in the moon. And of all of those interpretations, it's probably the Asian that is the most accurate. When rabbits give birth to their young, within 28 days, the young are capable of living on their own. that is a lunar cycle, that lunar rhythm at play within that animal's life and thus within your life. 28 days is the lunar month. So if you have rabbits showing up in your life and you have something going on, recognize it won't take more than 28 days and you'll see where things are going to unfold for you. Now, rabbits are often associated with fear because they freeze. This is not a fear response. This is an adaptive behavior. Most predators recognize prey by their movement. And it's that movement that alerts them to a potential prey that they can feed upon. So, for example, a hawk that's sitting in the tree that sees a squirrel saying, no, I don't want a squirrel. I want to wait for a rabbit to come by. They don't do that. They recognize the movement, and that's what they go after. A rabbit's ability to freeze is a way of avoiding predation. So if you have rabbits showing up in your life and you're unsure about a decision or a choice or something that you were wanting to do, freeze. Don't do anything. Within 28 days, you'll know exactly what you need to do. And the interesting thing is rabbits have these unique qualities and characteristics. They never do anything step by step. They do it in little hops and jumps. So if a rabbit shows up in your life and you're unsure about what to do in regards to something, freeze. Don't do anything. Within 28 days, you'll know exactly what you need to do. And like a rabbit, even if you have to backtrack, you'll make up your lost ground. When that animal shows up, study its biological rhythm, study its basic characteristics, study how it adapts, and study its relationship to environment, because all of those are applying to your life. That's part of why it has shown up in your life at this time. And it's interesting because it's hard once we get beyond that, trying to figure out sometimes what the animal actually means. But if we start with those four things, we're laying a foundation. Keep in mind, too, that the animal always means at least what you think it is, but it always means more. So if you think that this was a warning of some kind when this animal appears in your life, it may be. It may not necessarily be a warning of immense danger, but it may be warning you that, look, there's something coming up that if you take advantage of, it may be more of an alert type of warning. Take advantage of it and it will work out for you. It's important to understand that the more you know about the animal, and the more you know about the truth of its life, its behaviors and such, the more you're going to be able to incorporate it into your own unique life circumstance. And that means that we have to study it. We have to look at how it is operating in its own life circumstances and then apply them to our own unique situation. And it actually comes down to figuring out the truth of its meaning within your own life circumstances. Truth is kind of a word that's tossed around, and I always like to use a particular story to kind of help demonstrate this fact. There was a man who had a wonderful life. He had a great job. He had a beautiful wife, talented. He had creative, well-behaved children. He was well-respected. He had everything that he thought could be beneficial, but he always thought that there was something missing, some piece to the puzzle of life, that if he just had that one truth, everything would become clear. And over the years, he would talk about this missing truth that he wanted to find. He even went so far as to name it. He called it his Lady Truth. If I just had Lady Truth, everything would be ideal. And after many years of listening to him complain about not having this truth and figuring out how to apply it to his life, his wife turned to him one day and she said, look, why don't you go on a quest for your Lady Truth? Sign everything over to me first, but then go on your quest. Well, he thought about it, and he did. He signed everything over to her, and he went on this great quest to find his Lady Truth. And he talked to mystics, and he talked to priests, and he talked to priestesses, and he climbed mountains and crossed great seas and traveled the world trying to find that one simple truth. And after many years of questing and not finding it, he was standing at the top of a mountain and he's looking down over the earth below. And he's thinking to himself that maybe that truth is he needs to learn to be content with what he has. And it was at that moment that he noticed off to his left a small cave. And he walked over and he stood in the mouth of the cave, and as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw an old woman sitting on the dirt floor. And her hair hung down in greasy strands. She was so thin that her bones seemed to protrude through her skin, which was the color of old yellow parchment. And when she looked up at him and smiled, she only had one tooth in her head. But when she spoke, her voice was so soft and so lyrical that it touched his heart. And he knew in that moment he had found his Lady Truth. And he stayed with her for a year and a day and learned everything that she had to teach. And at the end of that year and a day, he stood once more in the mouth of the cave, and he looks at this old woman sitting on the floor. And he says, Lady Truth, you have done so much for me. Is there not something that I can do for you? As she closes her eyes and she thinks for a minute, and when she opens them, she smiles that near toothless grin and she says, yes. When you speak of Lady Truth to the outer world, as you will, tell them I am young and beautiful. When we look at the truth of what animals mean, we need to begin at the very least with what we think they do. And then we begin to explore a little bit further, because they will always mean more than what we think. It will always be more, because they are multidimensional. They explain things on various aspects of our life. They are like dream symbology in that way. The images and the symbols in our dreams reflect multiple things that are going on in our life. Those animals that show up in our life, at the very least, mean on the surface what we think it means. But there's always so much more. And this is why studying the animal is so important, because it helps us uncover deeper truths about this animal and its application to our own unique life circumstances. It will tell us so much more about how to accomplish things, how to resolve issues, how to heal certain aspects of our life, because they serve multiple purposes. And the truth is, we will have some animals that are with us off and on through our entire lifetime, but we will also have other animals that just show up for very short periods to give us a clue as to how to solve a problem, how to resolve an issue, how to develop a particular characteristic, and then move on, just passing by as brief messengers for us. And we need to look and recognize that any animal that we encounter has some meaning for us, that there is significance. People often ask me, is every animal you encounter significant? And yes, I look for the significance of everything. Doesn't necessarily mean, as I said earlier, that it has a personal, distinct message, but maybe the significance is I'm not taking enough time to appreciate what's going on in the world around me. And maybe that's where I need to start focusing. So we start by looking at what on the surface it means to us, but then we start looking at what its biological rhythm is. Take a look at how it adapts to survive in the wild. Take a look at what its own unique characteristics are. Take a look at how it works within the environment. Give you another example. We take a look at something like the turtle. Turtle has a very slow metabolism and moves along very, very slowly in life. This is an animal that is very, very unique in that it carries on its back this shell, which is its actual back. It does not separate, it does not come out of it like in the cartoons. But the shell is very, very significant. If you look at the shell of any tortoise or turtle, you will find that there are two kinds of markings on every turtle shell. There is an outer ring that goes around the outer edge, and then there's the intersection that is divided. That outer section almost always has 28 little miniature sections in it. The interior part of the shell almost always has 13. And this ties the turtle to a lunar rhythm. In any one lunar month, there's 28 days. In any one year, there's either 13 new moons or 13 full moons. So it has that kind of aspect. But it is also an animal that never does anything quickly. It says, take your time, one step at a time. That's its characteristic. That's also how it adapts. One of its adaptive behaviors is to pull into its shell. There are times where we need to just pull back. If things are too stressful, things are too hectic around us, pull back into your shell a little bit. And recognize that it works very compatibly with the environment in which it lives. moving from both the water to the land and back and forth, and relates very, very well to it, showing us how we can relate to new environments and new people in new environments, regardless of the circumstances. So we need to begin with the simple truth of asking ourselves, what do I think this means? And then let's study the animal, because that is where the true significance and application to our life really begins to empower us. That is when that animal truly starts to become a totem for us. Once we've begun to study the animal and look for the truth of how it applies to our own unique life circumstances, one other thing that we can do that will help to facilitate this is take a look at the species and what kind of genre it belongs to. For example, if this is a canine or a wolf that is showing up somewhere in your life, this is a mammal family. All mammals have certain things in common. They are warm-blooded, they give milk, they care for their young, they live predominantly upon the land, although we do have mammals such as the dolphins and the whales that also have meaning and significance for us as well, that are also mammals but living within a different environment and teach us how to do things within other environments as well. If you have an insect, all insects go through metamorphosis of some kind. And so anytime you have any insect, regardless of whether it's a butterfly, whether it's a beetle, this is an animal that in some way is going to teach you about transformation and how to work with transformation and metamorphosis within your life. If it is an animal that is something such as a fish, and we can have fish as totems. These are animals that have learned to adapt in very, very unique way of being able to move and to flow more swiftly through watery kinds of environments. This is an animal that learns to live in unusual kinds of environments with unusual kinds of creativity. And it's not unusual to find that people that have some kind of fish as a totem have a unique kind of creativity about them and need their own kind of support, family, and environment around them as well. Reptiles are all cold-blooded. And this, I think, is very, very significant because cold-blooded animals take on the temperature of whatever the environment is. If you have a reptile that is one of your predominant totems, you need to be careful about what kind of environment you put yourself into. You will take on the energy of that environment, and we need to be aware of this. If you're with a partying group, you may be the one with the lampshade on your head. If you're with a group that's somewhat depressing, you may find yourself suicidal. You take on the energy of that group, and that's one of the lessons associated with working with reptiles, of being sensitive to that environment and to the elements within that environment. We need to be aware of this. And then at the same time, recognize that these animals that are drawn to us and that we are drawn to have greater significance from more than just a personal level. People often ask me, they say, well, I'm always interested in dolphins, I'm always interested in wolves, and those are the animals that seem to get the most attention in society. Those are the ones that are always the most popular, but yet I really feel like this is my totem. And I say, well, it probably is. But recognize, too, that those animals that capture society's attention, that seem to capture the fascination, have some unique lessons for society as a whole. And I find it very fascinating that wolves and dolphins kind of fall into this category. They are both mammals. They live in two very, very different kinds of environments, but they are both mammals in that they produce milk, they are warm-blooded, things along this particular line. But they also have other qualities in common as well. Both animals are two of the most communicative animals upon the planet. They both have intricate body language. They both have intricate vocal language. They communicate. They live in groups, the wolf in the pack, the dolphin in the pod. And within those groups, they have their own kind of environment and miniature society. They each have their own particular role within that group. So you may have, for example, an alpha male and an alpha female in the wolf pack, but that alpha male may not be the best hunter of the group. So when it comes time for hunting, the alpha male knows his role, steps aside, and lets the best hunter of the group lead the hunt. They know their roles within the group and they work accordingly. And maybe, just maybe, the reason society as a whole is fascinated by them because they can teach us something about recognizing our role in society and giving over our role to those that are more better prepared, as well as how to use communication as a way of being able to work in a group and in society a little bit more effectively, both vocally as well as through body language. So we want to take a look at everything associated with that animal, especially if this is an animal that has been showing up time and time again within your life. And which brings us back a little bit to the beginning. We're going to get into in a little bit on how to connect with these animals a little bit more powerfully, a little bit more effectively to bridge them into your life. But we start with studying them, but also recognizing that some animals are just messengers that pass through temporarily to give us some guidance about situations in our life. Others show up often on periodically throughout our entire life. They are our lifetime totems. Their basic qualities reflect basic qualities, basic energy patterns within us throughout our entire lifetime. Some are showing up just to help us with healing aspects, maybe healing things of the past as well as healing physical illnesses that we are experiencing. So they will serve